"Don't hurt me. I'll give you sons," she cried. But the giant Apache just sat beside her and listened. That's what folks whispered when the dust settled. A lone frontier widow, a silent warrior, no gunfire, no threats. Just a moment that rattled the town more than any outlaw ever could. Now, the church bell rings uneasy, the sheriff watches from his window, and the wind carries questions no one dares answer out loud. What did she see in the eyes of the man everyone feared? And why hasn't he left? When silence sits at your door instead of violence, what truth is waiting to be heard? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today? And how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Martha Ellen Riker counted her small flock of sheep near the trickling creek. Sweat dampened her collar while she squinted against the glare, watching the animals graze on what sparse grass remained in this drought-stricken August of 1887. The creek had shrunk to barely a whisper, but it still offered enough water for their modest needs. A few yards away, beneath the old sycamore's dappled shade, 7-year-old little Lottie sat cross-legged with her precious sketchbook. Martha smiled, watching the child's small hands move carefully across the paper. That book had become Lottie's voice in the months since Martha had taken her in, telling stories that the girl's shy nature kept locked inside. The peaceful scene shattered with Lottie's sudden scream. Martha's heart lurched as she snatched up the loaded shotgun that never left her side. Her boots kicked up dust as she ran, fear driving her faster than she thought possible in this heat. "Lottie! Baby, I'm coming!" Martha skidded to a stop, her breath catching in her throat. There, beside her daughter, sat the largest Apache man she'd ever seen. His weather-worn face was etched with lines of experience, his long hair touched with gray at the temples. He held something in his hands with surprising gentleness. Terror seized Martha's chest. The stories of raids and kidnappings flooded her mind, tales whispered by neighbors about settlers who'd lost everything. The gun trembled in her hands as words spilled out before she could stop them. "Don't hurt me! I'll give you sons!" The moment the desperate offer left her lips, Martha felt shame wash over her. The Apache warrior's dark eyes met hers, not with menace but with something that looked almost like understanding. With deliberate care, he placed Lottie's sketchbook, the one Martha hadn't even noticed was missing, onto a nearby rock. Then he rose to his full height, inclined his head slightly, and walked away with quiet dignity into the canyon shadows. Martha rushed to gather Lottie in her arms, checking her for any harm. "Are you hurt? Did he frighten you? What happened?" But Lottie only shook her head, her small fingers clutching Martha's worn cotton dress. The child's eyes followed the retreating figure, with none of the fear Martha had expected to see. That night, sleep proved elusive. Martha lay in her narrow bed, listening to Lottie's soft breathing from the nearby cot, while her mind replayed the encounter over and over. The man's careful handling of the sketchbook, the gentle way he'd acknowledged her presence, it all contradicted everything she'd been raised to believe about the Apache. How long had he been watching them from those canyon walls? The thought should have terrified her, but somehow it didn't. If his intentions had been harmful, surely he'd had countless chances before today. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Martha heard Lottie stirring. The girl padded over to Martha's bed, climbing in beside her as she often did in the early morning hours. Martha stroked the child's dark hair, gathering courage to ask what she needed to know. "Lottie, honey, have you seen that man before?" Lottie nodded against Martha's shoulder. "When?" The girl sat up, her face serious as she held up her fingers one by one, counting occasions Martha had never known about. "Is that why you screamed yesterday, because he scared you?" Lottie shook her head vigorously. She reached for her sketchbook, always kept close, and flipped to a new page. Her small hands moved quickly as she drew, a simple picture of herself, Martha, and a tall figure watching from distant rocks. Then she added another drawing, coyotes running away from their sheep pen, with the same tall figure standing guard. "The big quiet man," Lottie whispered, using one of her rare spoken phrases. "He watches, keeps us safe." Martha's throat tightened as she studied the drawings. All this time she thought they were alone out here, vulnerable on the edges of civilization. Instead, they'd had a guardian she'd never suspected, one who'd chosen to protect rather than harm. She remembered her shameful words from yesterday. "I'll give you sons," and felt her cheeks burn anew. The man's response to her fear had been to demonstrate peace, to show through actions rather than words that he meant them no harm. The morning after their encounter with the Apache man, Martha's hands trembled as she gathered eggs from the henhouse. Each shadow made her start, though she knew her fear was now mixed with shame. Her words from yesterday haunted her. "I'll give you sons." What kind of desperate offer was that to make? And to someone who'd shown nothing but gentleness? Inside their small cabin, Lottie sat at the rough-hewn table, her pencil moving steadily across paper. Martha set down her basket of eggs and peered over the child's shoulder. Her breath caught at the sight of a familiar tall figure, drawn in careful detail, the Apache man standing guard while dark shapes, coyotes, slunk away from their sheep pen. "When did this happen, little one?" Lottie held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the last full moon. Martha remembered that night. She'd heard the coyotes yipping, but found no tracks near the sheep come morning. She'd credited their good fortune to chance. Now she knew better. The child flipped to another page, showing a bundle left at their gate during last winter's hardest month. Martha remembered that too. The mysterious appearance of dried meat and corn when their supplies had run desperately low. She'd assumed it was from the mission church, though they rarely ventured this far out. "The big quiet man brought it," Lottie whispered, her small finger tracing the drawing, "when the snow was deep." Martha sank into a chair, her mind whirling. All this time, they'd had a protector she'd feared instead of thanked. The weight of her misjudgment settled heavy on her heart. By mid-morning, Martha had loaded her old mule with eggs to sell in town. She helped Lottie mount up behind her, the child's arms wrapping secure around her waist. The summer heat already shimmered across the dusty trail as they set out. Millerton was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings with false fronts and a single dusty street, but it served as the only market for miles around. Martha noticed the changed atmosphere as soon as they arrived. Clusters of townspeople stood in tight groups, their voices low but urgent. "Seen up near Potter's Creek. Getting bold, coming so close. Ought to send for the cavalry." Martha kept her head down as she tied the mule to the hitching post. She knew they were talking about Indians, probably about her visitor from yesterday. The thought that someone might have seen him near her property made her stomach clench. Inside the general store, Mrs. Potter counted out coins for Martha's eggs while continuing a conversation with another customer. 3 different families reported seeing them this week. My Herbert says they're Western Apache, probably come down from the high country on account of the drought. Martha gathered her payment quickly, adding only the bare necessities to her order: coffee, sugar, a new pencil for Lottie. Her daughter's small hand stayed firmly in hers as they hurried back to their mule. In the shade of the livery stable, Martha closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. "Lord, grant me wisdom. Show me the right path." The answer didn't come in words, but in the memory of that gentle hand placing Lottie's sketchbook on the rock. The sun was lowering toward the western mesas when they heard hoofbeats approaching their cabin. Martha's heart jumped until she recognized Tom Wesley, who sometimes carried mail and official papers to outlying homesteads. "Evening, Ms. Riker," he called, dismounting stiffly. "Got a letter here needs delivering to you personal-like." He pulled a sealed envelope from his saddlebag, the official stamp of the Territory Land Office clearly visible. Martha's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, the writing formal. "Notice is hereby given that pursuant to the new Homestead Verification Act of 1887, all claims must demonstrate valid occupation rights through male line inheritance or protection within 14 days of receipt of this notice. Failure to provide such verification may result in forfeiture of claim." The words blurred as Martha fought back tears. 2 weeks. They were giving her 2 weeks to prove she had a right to the home she'd worked so hard to build. As if a woman alone couldn't work land, couldn't raise crops and tend animals and make a life for herself and her child. "Bad news?" Tom asked, still hovering by his horse. Martha folded the paper carefully. "Just some paperwork to handle," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside. "Much obliged for bringing it out." After Tom rode away, Martha sat on the porch steps, holding Lottie close as the evening shadows lengthened across their small patch of earth. The child's fingers worried at the hem of her dress. "Mama!" Lottie's voice was barely a whisper. "Do we have to leave our home?" Martha pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to fall. "No, baby," she said, though she had no idea how she'd keep that promise. "This is our home. We'll find a way to stay." But as darkness settled over the land, Martha had never felt more alone or more afraid. Everything she'd built, everything she'd made for herself and Lottie, balanced on the edge of a knife, all because she was a woman alone. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Martha hitched up her mule before the sun had fully risen, leaving Lottie sleeping under her patchwork quilt. The territorial notice weighed heavy in her pocket as she rode the 5 miles into town, rehearsing what she would say to Reverend Wills. The white-painted church sat alone at the edge of Millerton, its small bell tower reaching toward heaven like a pleading finger. Martha found the Reverend in his study, morning light streaming through dusty windows onto his graying hair. He looked up from his Bible with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Martha Ellen," he said warmly, rising to offer her a chair. "What brings you out so early?" Her hands shook slightly as she handed him the notice. The paper crackled as he read, his expression growing grave. 14 days, he murmured. "They're not giving folks much time." "What am I to do?" Martha's voice cracked. "Everything I have, everything I've built for Lottie, it's all tied to that land." Reverend Wills removed his wire-rimmed spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "The territorial government is pushing hard on these verification laws. They want proper order out here, their kind of order." He sighed deeply. "What they really want is men running the homesteads. But surely there's some way." "The simplest solution would be finding a husbandly figure," he said carefully. "Someone to validate your claim. It needn't be a real marriage, just a man willing to stand before the land office and speak for your right to stay." Martha's chest tightened. "You mean lie?" "I mean protect what's rightfully yours." The Reverend's eyes held a hint of steel beneath their kindness. "Sometimes justice requires us to work around unjust laws." But Martha could see the hesitation in his face. Even he, with all his compassion, couldn't openly defy territorial law. She left the church feeling more lost than when she'd arrived. The ride home seemed longer than usual, each hoofbeat of her mule echoing her worries. Near the creek where her property began, something caught her eye, tracks in the soft mud. She dismounted to look closer. The prints were barefoot, wide-set, larger than any she'd seen before. Her heart quickened as she remembered the Apache man's silent presence. That evening, as Martha prepared supper, a commotion erupted from the sheep pen. The animals' bleating carried a note of panic she recognized all too well. Grabbing her rifle from beside the door, she hurried outside, leaving Lottie safely inside. The sunset painted the sky blood red as Martha approached the pen. There, just beyond her fence, stood Chikane. His massive frame was silhouetted against the dying light, hands empty and raised slightly to show he carried no weapons. A movement in the shadows revealed what had spooked the sheep, a tawny mountain lion slinking away into the gathering darkness. Martha lowered her rifle slowly. "You were protecting them," she said softly, understanding flooding through her. He inclined his head slightly, neither advancing nor retreating. Taking a deep breath, Martha gestured toward her cabin porch. Would you like to sit a spell?" For a long moment he stood motionless. Then, with the fluid grace of a wild thing, he moved toward the porch. Martha's heart hammered as he settled onto the top step, his presence both powerful and carefully contained. "Wait here," she said, though something told her he wouldn't leave. Inside, her hands trembled as she cut thick slices of fresh cornbread and poured chicory coffee into 2 tin mugs. Lottie watched wide-eyed from her corner as Martha gathered the simple offering. When she returned to the porch, Chicane sat exactly where she'd left him, as still as the mountains themselves. She handed him a mug and plate, then settled carefully on the other end of the step. The evening air filled with the song of crickets and the distant cry of a nighthawk. He ate slowly with dignity, savoring each bite of cornbread. Martha sipped her coffee, stealing glances at his weathered profile. When he finally turned to look at her, their eyes met without the barrier of fear that had colored their first encounter. His dark gaze held depths of understanding that made her breath catch. Grief recognized grief. Loneliness knew loneliness. They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to appear, 2 souls sharing bread and coffee on the edge of the wilderness, while somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The next morning's light hadn't yet touched the horizon when Martha heard the soft creak of wood outside. She wrapped her shawl tighter and peered through the cabin window. There, outlined against the pre-dawn gray, stood Chicane's massive form by the broken gate. He worked with quiet purpose, using her tools from the barn as if he'd known exactly where to find them. Martha eased the door open, careful not to wake Lottie. The cool morning air carried the scent of sage and damp earth. She watched from the doorway as Chicane's skilled hands worked the wood, his movements precise and unhurried. The broken hinges that had plagued her for weeks were already half mended. Words formed and died on her lips. What could she say to this man who kept appearing like a spirit, fixing what was broken without being asked? The silence stretched between them, comfortable as an old quilt. A soft padding of bare feet behind her announced Lottie's presence. The child slipped past, clutching her latest drawing. Martha recognized the careful strokes of charcoal on the rough paper. 3 figures standing together, one tall and broad, one slender with a skirt, and one small between them, a family. Lottie approached Chicane without hesitation, holding out her offering. His weathered hands, strong enough to bend iron, took the paper with infinite gentleness. He studied it for a long moment, touching each figure as if blessing them. Something shifted in his eyes, a softening like snow beginning to melt. Martha found herself moving closer, drawn by the intimacy of the moment. "Would you like some breakfast?" she asked. "Least I can do, seeing as you're mending our gate." He nodded once, following them inside. The cabin felt different with him there, smaller yet somehow more complete. While Martha worked at the stove, Lottie showed him more drawings. He pointed to details, nodding appreciation, his silence full of understanding. Over cornmeal, mush, and coffee, Martha gathered her courage. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. "Seems wrong, breaking bread with a stranger." He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something heavy in his mind. "Chicane," he finally said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "Chicane," Martha repeated carefully, wanting to honor the trust he'd shown in sharing it. He nodded, approval warming his dark eyes. They worked together through the morning, passing tools without words, finding a rhythm as natural as breathing. Chicane showed Lottie how to hold the nails just so, letting her help in small ways that made her beam with pride. By noon, the gate swung true on its hinges, strong enough to last through winter. That evening, after Chicane had melted back into the landscape like a shadow, Martha sat at her small desk. The lamp's yellow light pooled around her as she began a letter to her sister Sarah in Kansas. The pen scratched across the paper, then stopped. How could she explain what was happening here? How this Apache man, whom others would call dangerous, had become something else entirely? A guardian, perhaps, or something more complex she didn't have words for yet. She stared at the half-written letter until the lamp burned low, then folded it away unfinished. Some things couldn't be explained to those who weren't here to see them. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Martha dressed Lottie in her best calico dress, smoothing the child's dark hair with extra care. They found Chicane already on the porch, as if he'd known their routine. He watched them hitch up the wagon, understanding in his eyes. "We'll be back after service," Martha told him. He nodded, settling onto the porch step like a sentinel. The small church was already filling when they arrived in town. Martha felt the weight of stairs as she helped Lottie down from the wagon. Whispers followed them up the church steps, carried on the morning breeze. "Reverend Wills?" she said after the service while Lottie waited in the church garden. "Might I have a word in private?" The whispers rose like startled birds as she followed him to his study. She could almost hear the speculation, a widow asking for a private meeting with the preacher. But Martha squared her shoulders and closed the door behind her, knowing some conversations needed privacy to bloom into truth. The small room smelled of leather-bound books and lamp oil. Through the window, Martha could see Lottie drawing in the dust with a stick, waiting patiently. Somewhere miles away, she knew Chicane waited too, guarding their home with the same patient strength that had mended their gate. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Martha's homestead as Reverend Wills's wagon rattled up the dusty path. He pulled his team to a stop, eyes widening at the sight before him. There, beside the barn, stood Chicane, methodically constructing what appeared to be a chicken coop from salvaged lumber. Martha hurried out to meet the Reverend, her skirts rustling against the dry grass. "I can explain," she said softly, watching as the older man climbed down from his wagon seat. "Perhaps we should talk inside," he suggested, his weathered face unreadable. In the cabin's cool shade, Martha poured chicory coffee into tin cups while Lottie played outside. Through the window they could see Chicane continuing his work, measuring each board with careful precision. "He's been watching over us," Martha explained, her hands wrapped around her cup. "Long before I knew he was there, protecting us from coyotes, leaving food when times were lean." She told him everything, the sketchbook, the cougar, the mended gate. Reverend Wills listened in silence. His gray head bowed. When she finished, he remained quiet for a long moment. "During the relocations," he finally said, his voice heavy with memory, "I was an army chaplain. Saw things no man of God should have to see. Did things, too, by staying silent when I should have spoken." Martha watched as he absently rubbed his thumb across a small cross pinned to his coat lapel. "The Army called it peacekeeping. But there's no peace in forcing people from their ancestral lands. No peace in breaking treaties." He looked up at Martha, his eyes clouded with old pain. "That man out there, he has more right to this territory than any of us." The sun was setting when Reverend Wills suggested they pray together. Chicane joined them on the porch, standing quietly as the preacher's words floated up into the darkening sky. The prayer was different from his usual sermons, simpler, more humble, asking for wisdom rather than declaring it. After supper, the Reverend announced he would sleep in his wagon nearby. "Just to keep watch," he said, though Martha suspected he had more on his mind. Morning came with the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. Martha found the two men already up, sitting on opposite ends of the porch. The Reverend stood as she approached, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Riker," he began carefully, "I've been giving your situation considerable thought. The land office's demands are unjust, but they are law. However," he glanced at Chicane, who remained seated, face impassive, "there might be a solution." Martha's heart quickened. "What kind of solution?" "A marriage contract," the Reverend said slowly. "Not one of romance or traditional expectations, but a legal arrangement purely to protect your claim to the land. A marriage of mutual protection, nothing more." Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the porch railing, trying to steady herself. "But how would that even work? The territory has laws against Indians marrying whites, yes," the Reverend nodded. "But there are ways. Ways that good people have found to do what's right, even when the law's wrong. He looked at Chikane. It would need to be kept quiet, of course, but it could save your home. Chikane rose to his full height, his shadow stretching across the wooden planks. He looked at Martha for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his steady stride carrying him toward the distant hills. Martha watched him go, her throat tight. Did we offend him? The Reverend shook his head. I reckon he needs time to think. It's no small thing I've suggested. But days passed and Chikane didn't return. Martha found herself watching the hills, hoping to catch a glimpse of his familiar silhouette. The chicken coop stood unfinished, tools laid out as if waiting for his return. Each morning she checked for footprints near the sheep pen, but found only coyote tracks. Lottie grew quiet, spending hours under the sycamore tree with her sketchbook, drawing pictures of their missing friend. He'll come back, she would say with a child's certainty, but Martha heard the worry in her voice. A week passed, then another. The land office deadline loomed closer. Martha tried to keep busy, tending the sheep, gathering eggs, mending clothes, but her eyes kept drifting to the hills. Each night she sat on the porch remembering how it felt to share silence with someone who understood it. Maybe he's really gone, she whispered one evening, watching the sun sink behind the mesas. The thought settled like a stone in her chest, heavy with loss. Not just the loss of her land, which now seemed inevitable, but the loss of something else, something unexpected and precious that had been growing as quietly as wildflowers after rain. 3 days after the Reverend's visit, dark clouds gathered over the mesas, turning the afternoon sky an ominous shade of purple-gray. Martha hurried to pull the freshly washed sheets from the line, the wind whipping them like sails. As she wrestled with a bedspread, movement caught her eye. There, silhouetted against the stormy horizon, stood Chikane. He was dragging a massive fallen pine tree across the ridge, likely brought down by last week's winds. Her heart leaped into her throat. He had returned. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Chikane made his way down the slope. Without a word, he dropped the tree near the woodpile and immediately turned his attention to the loose shingles on the cabin's roof. Martha had been meaning to fix them for weeks, but climbing up there alone hadn't seemed wise. "The ladder's in the barn," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing pulse. He nodded once, already moving toward the barn's weathered doors. Lottie emerged from the cabin, her eyes wide with joy at seeing him. She rushed to help, passing up tools as Chikane worked to secure the roof. The wind grew stronger, bending the sycamore's branches and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as Chikane hammered in the last shingle. They hurried inside, Lottie gathering her drawings from the porch while Martha stoked the hearth. Thunder cracked overhead, making the windows rattle in their frames. Chikane settled himself by the fire, his presence filling the small room with a sense of completeness that Martha hadn't realized was missing. Lottie curled up nearby, sketching contentedly as the storm raged outside. The familiar scratch of her pencil mixed with the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Martha busied herself making supper, stealing glances at the quiet man by her hearth. Questions burned in her throat, but she held them back, letting the peaceful silence stretch between them like a warm blanket. After Lottie had gone to bed, Martha finally found her courage. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming back and for fixing the roof." Chikane stared into the flames for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse. "I had a family." The words seemed to pain him, like stones being pulled from deep within. "They are gone. I will help this one." Martha's hands trembled as she set down her mending. This was the most he had ever said at once, and the weight of his loss hung heavy in each word. She thought of her own grief, of the empty side of her bed, of the way Lottie sometimes cried in her sleep for parents she barely remembered. Drawing a deep breath, Martha straightened her spine. "The Reverend's idea," she began carefully, watching his face in the firelight. "About the marriage contract. Would you consider it?" Chikane turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Not for the land," he said firmly. "No," Martha agreed quickly. "Not for the land." He stood and walked to where Lottie's latest drawing lay on the table, a picture of the three of them together standing before the cabin. His weathered finger traced the child's careful lines. "She must agree," he said. "It is her family, too." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. Of course, he understood what she had learned through hard experience. The children must have a voice in matters that change their lives. "We'll ask her in the morning," she promised. But a small voice spoke from the bedroom doorway. "I already agree." Lottie stood there in her nightgown, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She looked between them, her young face serious in the firelight. "I've been drawing us as a family since the day you brought back my sketchbook." Before either adult could respond, Lottie crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Chikane's waist. After a moment's hesitation, his large hand came to rest gently on her head. Then she turned and hugged Martha too, binding them all together in a circle of acceptance. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed-clean world. As the sun rose, Martha hitched up the wagon, while Chikane loaded the pine tree he'd brought down, now cut into manageable lengths. They would need the wood in town, where they'd have to wait for the Reverend to make arrangements. Lottie sat between them on the wagon seat, her sketchbook clutched to her chest as they set out for town. Martha couldn't help glancing back at their homestead, growing smaller behind them. A trail of dust rose in their wake, golden in the morning light, marking their path toward a future none of them had expected. The wagon wheels creaked beneath them, a steady rhythm matching the beat of Martha's heart. She thought about how life could change, like weather across the mesas. How storm clouds could bring not just rain, but renewal. How family could be born not just of blood, but of choice and circumstance and the courage to trust. The morning sun cast long shadows down Main Street as Martha guided the wagon into town. Businesses were just opening their doors, storekeepers sweeping dust from wooden sidewalks. The steady clip-clop of the mules' hooves drew attention, and heads began to turn. Lottie sat between Martha and Chikane, her small hands still clutching her sketchbook. Martha felt the weight of stairs following them, heard the sudden hush fall over the street. A woman walking with her basket stopped mid-stride, her mouth falling open. Two men outside the general store ceased their conversation, cigars forgotten in their hands. "Look there," someone whispered loudly. "That's the Riker widow." The whispers rippled down the street like wind through prairie grass. "With that Apache, bold as brass." In broad daylight, Martha kept her eyes fixed ahead, though her cheeks burned. Beside her, Chikane sat straight-backed and still, his face carved from stone. Only his eyes moved, taking in everything while seeming to look at nothing. As they passed the sheriff's office, Martha glimpsed Sheriff Bill Gentry at his window. He stood with one hand resting on his gun belt, watching their progress with narrowed eyes. His weathered face gave away nothing, but his stance spoke volumes about his unease. The courthouse sat at the end of the street, a squat building of red brick with white trim. Martha pulled the wagon to a stop, her hands trembling slightly on the reins. Chikane stepped down first, then helped Lottie. When he turned to assist Martha, she felt the tension in his careful grip. Reverend Wills met them at the courthouse steps, his Bible tucked under one arm. "Good morning," he said quietly, nodding to each of them. His calm greeting felt like a shield against the hostile stares. Inside the courthouse was cool and dim. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor as they approached the clerk's desk. Martha noticed how Chikane had to duck slightly under the doorframe, how his broad shoulders seemed to fill the narrow space. The clerk's hands shook as he laid out the homestead partnership papers. Martha took the pen first, dipping it in ink. She signed her name with careful strokes. Martha Ellen Riker. The scratch of the nib seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. When it was Chikane's turn, he studied the paper for a long moment, Then, with deliberate movement, he made his mark. Not an axe, but a symbol that looked like mountains touching sky. The clerk sprinkled sand over the wet ink, his eyes darting nervously between them. Reverend Wills stepped forward to witness the signatures. He added his own name, then gathered the papers to file them away. No words were spoken, no congratulations offered. The only sound was the shuffle of paper and the tick of the wall clock. They stepped back into the harsh sunlight, blinking. A small crowd had gathered, maintaining a careful distance. Martha saw faces she knew, neighbors she'd traded with, women she'd sat next to in church. Now they looked at her as if she were a stranger. Old Jake Turner, who'd ranched the valley for 40 years, pushed through the onlookers. His face was red with anger as he approached. Before anyone could move, he spat deliberately at Chikane's feet, the glob of tobacco juice landing inches from his moccasins. Martha flinched, her hand flying to her mouth. But Chikane didn't move a muscle. He stood perfectly still, like a mesa weathering a storm, his eyes fixed on some distant point. His dignity in that moment made Turner's gesture seem small and mean. Reverend Wills stepped between them, his voice carrying clearly. "That's enough, Jake. These are God's children, same as you." The ride home was silent, but different from their journey into town. Now the silence felt protective, wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Lottie leaned against Martha's arm, while Chikane scanned the horizon with watchful eyes. The sun was setting by the time they reached the homestead, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Martha went about her evening routine, feeding the chickens, checking the sheep pen, pumping water for the night. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. In the growing darkness, she lit the kerosene lantern. Its warm glow filled the cabin's main room, casting long shadows on the walls. With careful steps, she carried it to the window facing the road and placed it there, a beacon in the gathering night. When she stepped onto the porch, she found Chikane laying out his bedroll near the door. His few possessions were arranged neatly beside it: a rolled blanket, a water skin, a leather pouch. "You don't have to sleep out here," Martha said softly. "There's room inside." Chikane shook his head once. "I keep watch," he said, his voice low and certain. Those 3 words carried the weight of a solemn vow. Whispers spread through town like wildfire over the next 7 days. Martha heard them clearly enough when she went to buy supplies, hushed voices that fell silent as she approached, only to rise again when she passed. "Living with a savage," someone muttered near the dry goods store. "That poor child," another whispered by the post office. Martha kept her chin high, though each word stung like a hornet. She focused on her errands, checking items off her list: flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil. The storekeeper's wife, who once shared recipes with her, now barely met her eyes while wrapping her purchases. The worst came when Lottie went to town with her. 2 boys, sons of local ranchers, pointed and laughed as the little girl walked past. "Hey, Indian! Does your new pa scalp people?" one called out. The other made whooping sounds, hands clapped over his mouth. Lottie's small shoulders hunched forward, her feet quickening. She clutched her slate board closer to her chest, her dark eyes filling with tears. Martha's heart broke at the sight. That evening, Martha made a decision. "We'll do your schooling at home," she told Lottie, stroking the girl's hair as they sat on the porch steps. "I've got my old Bible, and you're already reading well from your slate board." Lottie nodded, relief clear on her face. She traced letters in the dust with a stick, spelling out simple words as Martha had taught her. From the north pasture came the steady rhythm of Chikane's axe as he worked on the new fence line. He'd been building it methodically, post by post, from sunrise to sunset. Martha watched him sometimes, amazed at his quiet strength. He moved with purpose, every action precise and measured. The fence grew steadily, a second ring of protection around their land. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Martha did something different. Instead of taking her plate to eat alone in the kitchen while Chikane ate on the porch, she set 3 places at the table. When Chicane came in from his work, he paused in the doorway, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Martha gestured to the chair. "Please," she said softly. "Join us." He sat down carefully, as if afraid the chair might break under his large frame. Lottie beamed at him from across the table. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls as they shared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and wild greens. The silence felt comfortable until Martha found herself speaking of Thomas, her late husband. "He was a good man," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He believed in treating all folks fair. The cattle raids were happening on both sides. White men stealing from Indians, Indians stealing from settlers. Thomas tried to make peace, to find a middle way." She swallowed hard. "He died trying to stop a fight over stolen cattle. Neither side would listen." Chicane's dark eyes met hers across the table. "War eats sons," he said, his deep voice heavy with understanding. "That's all it knows." He looked down at his plate, and Martha saw the same grief in his face that she felt in her heart. The words hung in the air between them, a bridge of shared sorrow. Martha thought of Thomas, dead these 3 years. She wondered about Chicane's family, the ones he'd mentioned losing. The pain in his voice told her all she needed to know. Lottie slipped from her chair and went to fetch something from her corner by the hearth. She returned with her latest drawing, carefully done in charcoal on a piece of brown paper. She placed it on the table where they could all see. The drawing showed 3 figures standing together, a tall man, a woman, and a small girl between them. Behind them was the house, and above them a bright sun. Birds flew in the sky, and sheep grazed in the pasture. It was simple, done in a child's hand, but it captured something profound. Peace, home, family. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Chicane reached out one large hand and touched the drawing gently, as if blessing it. Lottie smiled up at them both, her face glowing in the lamplight. They sat there together, the 3 of them, while evening deepened outside and crickets began their nightly song. The lamp flame danced, casting their shadows on the wall. 3 shadows that merged into one. Later, after Lottie had gone to bed, Martha took the drawing and placed it carefully on the mantel above the hearth. It seemed right there, like it belonged. When she turned, she saw Chicane watching her, his eyes soft in the fading light. No words were needed. They both understood what was happening, slowly and surely, as the changing of seasons. This strange arrangement, born of necessity, was becoming something else entirely, something true and precious, like water in the desert. 10 days had passed since the courthouse filing. The morning air held the first hints of autumn as Martha stepped out to feed the chickens. Something caught her eye at the gate, a piece of paper nailed crude and crooked to the wooden post. She walked over, pulse quickening as she read the harsh words scrawled in black ink. "We don't let red men take white land." Her hands trembled as she tore down the note. The paper crumpled in her fist as she looked around, searching the distant ridgelines for whoever might have left this threat in the night. Only the wind answered, rustling through the dry grass. Chicane appeared beside her, silent as always. She handed him the note without a word. His face remained still as stone as he read it, but his eyes darkened like storm clouds. He touched the nail hole in the gatepost, then studied the boot prints in the dust. "2 men," he said quietly, "came before dawn." Martha hugged herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Should we tell the sheriff?" Chicane shook his head. "Law does not protect all the same." That evening, Martha tried to keep her worry from Lottie as they prepared for bed. The girl seemed to sense the tension anyway, staying close to Martha's side as they did their nightly chores. Chicane patrolled the property perimeter as usual, a dark shadow moving through the gathering dusk. Martha had just blown out the lamp when she heard it, the crack of a rifle shot, followed by the terrible sound of splintering wood. Orange light flared outside the window. Her heart stopped as she realized what it meant. "The barn!" she cried, running for the door. "Lottie, stay inside!" The barn was already engulfed in flames, fire licking up the dry wooden walls like hungry fingers. Two masked figures moved in the firelight, one holding a rifle, the other carrying a torch. Chikane emerged from the shadows like an avenging spirit, catching them by surprise. The fight was brutal and swift. Chikane knocked the rifle away with one powerful sweep of his arm, then met the men with nothing but his bare fists. Martha watched in horror as the three figures grappled in the fire-lit darkness. One attacker went down hard, clutching his ribs. The other swung the torch like a club, but Chikane dodged and struck back. The second man stumbled, his mask falling away to reveal a face Martha recognized. Young Tom Wesley from the Double Bar Ranch. The injured man scrambled to his feet, dragging his partner away into the darkness. They vanished into the night, leaving only the roaring flames behind. Martha ran for the well, and together she and Chikane worked to save what they could. But it was too late. The barn was lost. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, hoofbeats approached. Sheriff Bill Gentry rode up with two deputies, their badges catching the last light of the dying fire. The sheriff took in the scene with hard eyes, the smoking ruins, the dropped rifle, the signs of struggle in the dirt. "There was trouble here," he said, not a question. "Two men attacked our barn," Martha said, still breathless from fighting the fire. "They were masked, but this one fought them," Gentry interrupted, nodding toward Chikane. "With his hands?" "He was protecting our property," Martha protested. "They had weapons. He didn't." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Ma'am, I got reports of assault. Two men came to my office pretty badly hurt. Said your husband attacked them without provocation." He straightened in his saddle. "I got to take him in. For his own safety, you understand. Things being what they are." "No!" The cry came from the house. Lottie stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. She ran to Chikane, wrapping her arms around his waist. He placed one gentle hand on her head, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "You know this isn't right," Martha said, her voice shaking with anger. "You know who really started this." "What I know, and what the law says, ain't always the same thing," Gentry replied. "Now step aside, Mrs. Riker." Chikane carefully detached Lottie's arms from around him. He knelt down to look her in the eyes, touching her cheek once, then stood and held out his wrists to the deputies. They bound him quickly with iron cuffs. Martha mounted her horse and followed them into town, her heart pounding with each hoofbeat. At the jail, she confronted Sheriff Gentry in his office, while the deputies locked Chikane in a cell. "This is wrong, and you know it," she insisted. "Those men tried to burn us out. They left threatening notes. They're the ones who should be in that cell." "Mrs. Riker," the sheriff said wearily, "I got two witnesses saying your man assaulted them. That's against the law, no matter the reason. Now, I suggest you go home to your girl. She needs you more than he does right now." Martha rode home slowly, defeat weighing heavy on her shoulders. She found Lottie curled up in Chikane's bedroll on the porch, sobbing into the rough blanket. Martha gathered the girl into her arms, her own tears falling freely now. "He protected us," Lottie whispered between sobs. "He protected us and they took him away." "I know, sweetheart," Martha said, holding her close. "I know." She looked out at the smoking ruins of their barn, at the empty place where Chikane should be, and felt something hard and determined settle in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The jail's iron door creaked open at dawn. Martha stepped into the cool dimness, carrying a basket of fresh bread and clean bandages. Sheriff Gentry nodded to her from behind his desk, eyes heavy with a sleepless night. He gestured toward the cells without speaking. Chikane sat straight-backed on the narrow cot, his face a map of purple bruises and dried blood. Yet his eyes held the same quiet dignity she'd first seen by the creek. Through the iron bars, Martha saw the strength that had drawn her to trust him, even now. "I brought you something to eat," she said softly, passing the bread through the bars. He accepted it with a slight nod, but didn't eat. His knuckles were raw and swollen from defending their home. "How is the little one?" he asked, his voice rough. "Missing you something fierce," She barely slept. Martha touched the cold iron between them. Neither did I. Sheriff Gentry's boots scraped across the wooden floor as he approached. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Riker, might have a word." Martha followed him to his office where morning light streamed through dusty windows. The sheriff settled into his creaking chair and gestured for her to sit. "Got word from Judge Harrison's office in Santa Fe," he said, shuffling through papers on his desk. "Way things stand, can't release him without the judge's ruling. Unless ... Unless what? Unless you recant the marriage arrangement." Gentry met her eyes. "Say it was done under duress. Paper gets torn up, charges drop, he goes free, long as he leaves the territory." Martha's hands clenched in her lap. "And my land claim? Well, now, that'd be forfeit. But might be safer that way, all things considered." "Safer?" The word tasted bitter. "Like it was safer when rustlers killed my first husband? When fever took Lottie's parents? When we struggled alone until Chicane came?" She stood, chair scraping back. "That man defended our home with his bare hands against armed attackers. Where's the safety in sending him away out?" "Mrs. Riker Dash." "No." Martha's voice was steel. "I won't recant. I won't lie to save myself while injustice stands. If it takes the territorial judge to see right done, then that's where I'll go." She returned to Chicane's cell. He watched her with those deep, knowing eyes. "I'm riding to Santa Fe," she said, "to speak with Judge Harrison myself." "Long journey," he said quietly. "Dangerous alone." "Not alone. Taking Lottie with me. Pastor Williams promised to check our property." She gripped the bars. "I won't let them take our home or our family." Something softened in his face at the word family. He reached through the bars to touch her hand once, briefly. "Be careful, Martha Ellen Riker." The ride home was long and dusty. Martha found Lottie at the kitchen table, working intently on her drawings. Papers covered the wooden surface. Sketches of Chicane mending fences, building the chicken coop, reading with them by lamplight. Simple moments that spoke of belonging. "Pack your things, little one," Martha said. "We're going to Santa Fe." "To help Big Quiet Man?" "Yes, to help our family." That night, Martha knelt beside her bed, hands clasped tight. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't know if this is right or wise. But I know what justice feels like. I've seen it in a man who protects without violence, who builds instead of breaks. Give me strength to stand for truth, whatever comes." Dawn found them loading the wagon. Martha packed carefully Lottie's drawings, their marriage document, homestead papers, and letters from neighbors testifying to Chicane's character. She added bread, dried meat, and their warmest blankets. The territorial capital was 5 days' hard travel through rough country. Lottie climbed up beside her, clutching her precious sketchbook. "Will the judge help us?" Martha gathered the reins, looking east toward Santa Fe. "He'll hear our story, at least. Sometimes that's all truth needs, a chance to be heard." She clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward. Behind them, the rising sun painted their small homestead in gold. Martha felt the weight of everything they stood to lose, and everything they'd gained worth fighting for. Past the gate, she paused to look back one last time. The morning light caught the window where she'd first placed the lantern for Chicane, welcoming him home. Now it was their turn to bring him back where he belonged. "Ready?" she asked Lottie. The girl nodded, determination bright in her young face. Martha snapped the reins, and they began the long journey east toward justice. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as Martha and Lottie made their way east. Dust coated their clothes, and the August sun beat down mercilessly. Each night they camped under the stars, Martha keeping watch while Lottie slept curled beneath their warmest quilt. On their second evening, they spotted the weathered cross of St. Michael's Mission rising against the darkening sky. Sister Mary Catherine welcomed them with open arms, offering bowls of steaming bean soup and fresh cornbread. "The Lord provides shelter to all his children," the elderly nun said, watching Lottie sketch by candlelight. That night, the sisters gathered to pray for their safe journey and for justice to prevail. After 4 grueling days, the territorial capital's adobe buildings finally came into view. Martha's heart pounded as they approached the courthouse, its wooden steps worn smooth by countless feet seeking justice. The judge's assistant, Mr. Peterson, sat at a polished desk in the outer office. His spectacles caught the morning light as Martha stood before him, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Sir, I've come from Copper Creek about my husband's unlawful detention," Martha began. "He defended our home against armed attackers, yet he's the one behind bars." "Your husband?" Peterson's eyebrows rose. "The Apache man?" "Yes." Martha lifted her chin. "We were legally married to protect our homestead claim. But this is about more than land now. It's about what makes a family." She opened Lottie's sketchbook, showing the careful drawings of their daily life: Chicane, fixing fences, reading with Lottie, sharing meals at their table. "My daughter drew these. They show the truth of our home better than any words could." Peterson studied the drawings, then Martha's face. After a long moment, he nodded. "I'll speak with Judge Harrison. Wait here." The courtroom was silent, save for the slow turning of papers as Judge Harrison reviewed their case. Martha stood tall, Lottie's small hand in hers. She presented Reverend Wills's written testimony about Chicane's character and their marriage of mutual respect. "Your Honor," Martha's voice rang clear in the hushed room, "the law says a homestead needs a man's protection, but it doesn't say what kind of man or what makes a family. We found both in Chicane. He protects us not through force but through gentle strength and daily kindness." The judge leaned forward, studying Martha's face. "You speak with conviction, Mrs. Riker. And these drawings," he held up Lottie's sketches, "they tell a compelling story of home and family. Because that's what we are, Your Honor. A family. Not by blood, but by choice and love and trust." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "I will review this case immediately." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sheriff's office as the telegraph machine clicked out its message. Sheriff Gentry's weathered hands unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the official words from Santa Fe. He sighed, reaching for his ring of keys. "Reckon you're free to go," he said, unlocking Chicane's cell. The Apache man rose slowly, his bruised ribs still tender from the fight. "Judge says there ain't no charges that'll stick." Chicane nodded once, his dignity intact despite the days spent behind bars. He gathered his few belongings, a blanket, a tin cup, and the drawing Lottie had given him before his arrest. The paper was creased but carefully preserved. Sheriff Gentry watched him walk out, noticing how the tall man moved with purpose despite his injuries. "Best keep to your own property," he called after him. "Some folks ain't happy about this ruling." The late afternoon stretched into evening as Chicane made his way home on foot. He paused at the ridge overlooking the homestead, watching the setting sun paint the adobe walls golden. The new fence line he'd built still stood strong, and smoke curled from the chimney like a welcome sign. The creak of wagon wheels drew his attention. Through the settling dust, he spotted Martha and Lottie returning from their long journey. He walked down to meet them at the gate, where the young lambs bleated a greeting. Kneeling carefully, he ran his hand over their woolly heads, checking each one as if he'd never left. Martha climbed down from the wagon, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Lottie scrambled after her, rushing to hug Chicane's legs. He placed one gentle hand on her head, the other still stroking the lambs. "You must be hungry," Martha said softly. She disappeared into the house and returned with a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the morning's baking. This time, instead of setting it on the porch, she held the door wide. "Come inside, please." Chicane straightened, looking at the open door. After a moment's pause, he stepped across the threshold, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe. The familiar scent of wood smoke and cooking filled the room. As night settled over the ranch, they gathered around the hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as Lottie drifted to sleep in Martha's lap, her latest drawing clutched in one small hand. Chikane sat in the chair that had stood empty since Martha's first husband died, his presence filling the space naturally, without ceremony. No words were needed. The quiet wrapped around them like a blanket, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the distant cry of coyotes. In that moment of peace, the house felt truly whole. Not just shelter, but home. The late September breeze carried the scent of ripening apples as neighbors' wagons rolled up to the Riker homestead. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid Chikane now worked alongside him, replacing charred barn timbers with fresh-cut pine. Women who had whispered behind Martha's back brought dishes of cornbread and stewed beans, watching with quiet respect as Lottie helped serve the workers. Tom Henderson, whose family owned the adjacent ranch, wiped sweat from his brow as he and Chikane fitted a new crossbeam. "Never thought I'd be working next to an Apache," he admitted, testing the beam's strength. "Reckon I was wrong about some things." Chikane secured his end with steady hands, saying nothing. His silence spoke of dignity rather than resentment. Martha observed the transformation from her kitchen window, kneading dough for the evening meal. The barn's skeleton had grown stronger day by day, much like the bonds forming between once-distant neighbors. Even Sheriff Gentry had ridden out twice to check on their progress, bringing nails from the hardware store. Every Wednesday, Reverend Wills's wagon appeared on the horizon, right as regular as sunrise. He would sit with them after the day's work, often staying through supper. On one such evening, as Lottie cleared the plates, the old preacher's hands trembled around his coffee cup. "There's something weighing on me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "During the removal years, when I served as chaplain." He paused, looking at Chikane across the table. "I told families it was God's will, watched children torn from mothers, called it civilization's progress." Martha held her breath, but Chikane continued eating his bread, listening. "I was wrong," the Reverend continued. "Dead wrong. Been carrying that sin for 15 years. Chikane set down his cup slowly. "The past is heavy," he said, "but you choose different now." Reverend Wills's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "How can you not hate me?" "Hate makes more hate," Chikane replied. "My people know this. Your people must learn." Lottie, who had been quietly drawing at her small table by the hearth, brought over her latest work. The paper showed the ranch alive with movement, sheep leaping like dancers, giant sunflowers nodding in the wind. In the center stood 3 figures beneath a spreading cottonwood: Martha with her apron, Chikane, tall and strong, and Lottie between them, all holding hands. The Reverend touched the drawing gently. "Out of the mouths of babes," he whispered, "God's grace in pencil marks." As autumn deepened, the ranch flourished under their combined care. Chikane taught Lottie to identify healing plants along the creek bed. Martha expanded her garden, adding traditional Apache crops alongside her familiar vegetables. The sheep grew fat on late summer grass, and the new barn stood proud against the sky. One evening, as sunset painted the clouds rose and gold, Martha found Chikane sitting on the porch steps. He was watching Lottie chase grasshoppers in the yard, her laughter carrying on the cooling air. Martha sat beside him, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned slightly. "For what?" "For choosing peace when you had every right to choose anger. For showing me that family isn't about blood or race or what other folks think is proper." She twisted her hands in her lap. "For giving us both peace." Chikane was quiet for a long moment, watching Lottie dance with her shadow in the fading light. "You gave me peace too," he finally said. "When my family died, I thought my heart died with them. But you and little one," he gestured toward Lottie, "you showed me how to live again." Martha felt tears well up, but they were healing tears, like rain after drought. Lottie ran up with her latest drawing. This one showed all 3 of them planting sunflower seeds together, the blooms already reaching toward a smiling sun. "Beautiful?" Chikane said, and Lottie beamed. The evening settled around them like a gentle hand. From the barn came the soft bleating of sheep. A whippoorwill called from the cottonwood, and somewhere in the distance coyotes sang to the rising moon. But here on the porch, in the growing darkness, there was only peace, hard-won and precious, like water in the desert. The seasons turned like pages in Lottie's sketchbook, bringing new growth to the Riker homestead. August heat gave way to winter snows, then spring rains coaxed wildflowers from the earth. Now, a year later, the ranch flourished under their shared care. The porch had become more than just a gathering place. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the sound of children's voices drifted up from beneath its shade. Lottie, no longer the shy child who hid behind her drawings, sat cross-legged among 5 other children. Some Apache, some Mexican, 2 half-white. She helped them trace letters in the dust and sound out words from her beloved books. Martha watched from the kitchen window as she sealed another letter to her sister in Kansas. This one, unlike the hesitant notes of the past year, held nothing back. Her pen moved steadily across the paper. Dearest Sarah, I finally feel ready to tell you everything. About how a man the world feared brought peace to our home. About how Lottie bloomed like a desert flower after rain. About how God's grace comes in ways we least expect. The scratch of hammer against nail drew her attention outside. Chicane worked steadily, mounting the heavy chains for the new porch swing. His movements were sure and measured, each strike purposeful. The wooden seat, crafted from sturdy oak, gleamed with fresh varnish in the afternoon light. When the swing was secure, he tested it with his weight, then nodded in satisfaction. It will hold, he said simply, extending his hand to Martha. She settled beside him on the swing, its gentle motion matching the rhythm of the breeze. Below them, Lottie sat with her small circle of students, showing them how to draw the mountains that rimmed their valley. Their laughter floated up like music. Martha watched the sun paint long shadows across their land, proven by law and love and stubborn faith. The sheep grazed peacefully in the distance. The new barn stood strong. Even the old sycamore seemed to bend protectively over Lottie's little school. Do you remember, Martha said softly, what I said that first day? When I was so afraid. Chicane nodded, his eyes on the setting sun. I said I'd give you sons. Martha's voice grew stronger. But you never hurt me. You just listened and gave me something better than sons. Chicane's weathered hand found hers, strong and gentle. Together they watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors no artist could capture. Below them, a child's clear voice read aloud from a primer, stumbling over the words but pressing on with determination. The land was theirs now, earned by grace, defended by fight, preserved by faith. And in the growing dusk, the porch swing rocked slowly, carrying its precious cargo of hard-won peace. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.